It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe. Sam, Park and John Ramey with you on Friday, October 6th. We've got a hot jobs report. We've got a big strike in the healthcare sector, and we've got a snap election in Slovakia, a country that until very recently I knew very little about. So I'm excited to get into all of this. And also, we may have the world's first live vomiting on a podcast when I insert in the super yacht story from the Washington Post as a kicker.
No.
We'll just to hear Sam Park explain why that's not a relevant economic news story. I'll keep it short, but I thought, Sam, your point on that was so on the nose that it was worth reviewing, even though I know you do not wish to discuss super yachts nor the people that buy them.
Certainly not, but okay. I mean, if that's the worst thing that happens to me today, then I'm still having a pretty good day.
The United States job market is having a pretty good day as well. 336,000 new non-farm jobs added in September, according to the Labor Department. That is double what economists anticipated. Remember,
economists take it on the chin once again.
Once again, right? Well, as you have pointed out, economic science is a behavioral science, so it's a little less specific than physics.
Yes, it's dynamic. It studies situations that change fundamentally over time.
So 3 consecutive months, remember, under 200,000 jobs created. Well, it's a big jump back up above that 200,000 threshold, right? 336. And hiring figures for July and August were revised upward. It's like they're going through the couch cushions and they just find an extra 119,000 jobs.
Apparently,
yeah. So look, it's a big labor market. I get it.
Absolutely.
But,
I mean, it's the world's largest economy.
But it is, in fact, the job market component of the world's largest economy is doing better. It's not as cooled off as we thought in the summer. And of course, September now downright hot. And that means, Sam, that I can predict with all the force of my economic authority that the Fed's promise for one more rate hike this year is likely to come true.
Yes. And I read an article in last week's issue of The Economist that said that investors finally seem to be getting the idea that the Fed is going to keep interest rates high until inflation comes down, and that might take a little while, especially if jobs reports like this one keep coming out, because part of inflation is always wage inflation. Especially also if you factor in a lot of the labor actions that we've been talking about recently. If those wages go up, then that will only add, at least indirectly, to inflationary pressures. Unemployment
at 3.8%. That is unchanged from August. The unemployment rate has been below 4% since December of 2021. We have not, in the United States, had such a long stretch of low unemployment since the 1960s. The jobs added, again, 336,000 jobs added for the month of September, was the 33rd consecutive month of job growth. So there is no recession. We say this every week, not a politics podcast, but very interesting how the polling indicates President Biden does not get any credit for the economy. Apparently, voters think the economy is bad. The data says otherwise. A fascinating schism, I would say.
I suppose, but I still say that's mainly about inflation, right?
I would agree with you.
I think people just don't, that is, economic analysts don't really understand how much people hate inflation. I'm sure people have heard me say this before.
I was having a discussion with Helen, my partner, because she was looking at the jobs report this morning. And she says, "Oh, are you going to talk about this on the podcast?" I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, we are." She was talking about how what we have discussed, how the Fed, raising interest rates and making it harder for businesses to hire people is kind of the only crude mechanism that the central bank in the United States can bring to bear to slow down inflation. And Helen said, "Why doesn't the government implement price caps?" And I said, well, I think the answer to that is the last time that happened was the early 70s in the Nixon administration. So I don't believe it's politically viable in this country.
It doesn't really work.
That's what I told her, although I didn't have good data to back that up.
Because economists would say right? And with some justification, I might add. Much as I slag off economists, I would like to give them credit when they get things right. If you institute a price cap on any product, right, you actually disincentivize the production of that product, right? If a producer of widgets or whatever, some theoretical product, right, if they can only get a limited price on that product, then they will say, well, why should I bother producing them at all? Right?
Why
Not
should I
all,
grow this? Right.
yeah, not all of them, but some of them might do that. Therefore, you end up with a scarcity of widgets, and the price of widgets never comes down, right? So you're not actually doing anything. You might actually be exacerbating the very problem you're trying to solve.
I will be happy to play this very segment for her, but I will also point out perhaps we need a price cap on podcasts.
Well, the problem is that they're free, right?
That is the problem.
It tends to lead to a glut of the market, which we're participating in, unfortunately.
We are splashing around in that glut right now. Do you have any other thoughts on the jobs report? Oh, it did tickle the bond market. The bond yield is up, and the market kind of fluctuates because they're now anticipating another rate hike.
Yes, although the market is back up now, right? And so it's difficult. I don't really have much else to say about it, except that it just confirms the hypothesis that we've been working under for a number of months now, that inflation might be hard to tame, right? The economy still seems to be running relatively hot, at least in terms of how economists analyze it. There will have to be additional rate hikes. I mean, some forecasters were anticipating that the Fed might begin to cut rates early next year. I think people basically get it by now that that's not going to happen unless there's some sort of economic calamity which befalls us, which, by the way, could occur. But we'll get to that in case it does.
One other thing about inflation, right? We have talked about the rate of inflation coming down and trying to get it below 3% and then 2%, and how that last bit is difficult, a challenge for the central bank anywhere, but especially in the United States, or not maybe especially, but for the Fed here. I've also started to think about it like how we report on wildfires here in Southern California. You know about that, right? They talk about we have 70% containment. That fire is now 100% contained. A 100% contained fire just means
still burning. Yeah.
It's burning, but the firefighters have made a circle around
That's
it.
That's right. It just can't get any bigger. Yeah.
Right.
It is very much like that.
To Kaiser. The Kaiser strike, Kaiser Permanente, experiencing a walkout of approximately 75,000 medical workers this Wednesday. This is the largest walkout ever in the U.S. healthcare sector, striking employees in California, Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, represented by a coalition of unions, 8 unions in total. The biggest one is the Service Employees International Union - United Healthcare Workers West Union. This coalition comprises 40% of Kaiser Permanente's staff. The work stoppage is scheduled to end tomorrow, Saturday morning, but the union coalition said it is then planning a longer strike in November if this 3-day planned walkout doesn't bring Kaiser to the table.
That's right. I mean, they couldn't very well go on strike forever until their demands are met, because people get sick and, people need emergency care and the like, right? So they will go back to work, continue to provide care for people, but they'll come back out onto the picket lines if they don't see sufficient movement from Kaiser. And this actually feeds back to the discussion we were just having about the jobs report, right? And in the main gains in jobs were in 4 particular sectors, which were leisure, hospitality, government, and healthcare. So one of the main gripes about from the healthcare unions, that is, against Kaiser, was not just pay, although that's an important one, right? But what they define as a staffing crisis, in which ever since the pandemic, they've been woefully understaffed at all of their facilities. People are logging so much overtime, and there's so much employee burnout and people leaving their jobs, and for a number of reasons. And so hopefully some of those jobs added in healthcare last month were by Kaiser, right? Which, as an enormous healthcare employer in this country, I think we should expect that some of them were. But obviously, it'll take some doing to overcome what the unions are defining as a staffing crisis.
So the unions have specific numbers they want Kaiser to hit regarding hiring. And I also have a survey from January of like 18,000 nurses in the United States and a statistic that all ties together. Get this. The union wants Kaiser to hire 10,000 new healthcare workers to fill current vacancies. And they say also, quote, fix a broken hiring process or processes that are preventing full staffing. Okay. So the union has a number. They're like, hire this many more people because we're having to make up the gap. So in January, a survey of over 18,000 nurses conducted by AMN Healthcare Services found that 1/3 of nurses in the United States, 1/3 of nurses in the United States were considering leaving their profession after the pandemic left them overwhelmed and fatigued. Okay. 5 million medical workers in the United States did leave their jobs during the pandemic. And that has been an acute staffing crunch that has remained in the sector.
And it's scarcely abated at all.
And so the people who haven't left their job in healthcare are having to make up the gaps. Frankly, I think that 10,000, I mean, I'm not looking at Kaiser's books, but 10,000 new healthcare workers to make up for 5 million that left, that doesn't necessarily seem like that huge a request.
Well, keep in mind that healthcare is highly regulated state by state, right? You and I know about Kaiser because it's all over Los Angeles.
And it's from the Bay Area.
That's right.
I was born in a Kaiser hospital.
Honestly, I think the overwhelming majority of the workers on strike are in California, if I'm not mistaken. And they don't operate in every state. 10,000 is about 1 out of every 6 compared to the number of workers on strike. That's actually a lot.
Right. And that would move the needle in a specific state or region.
For them, absolutely. Right. And they also want, I believe, a $25 minimum wage for whatever, for the janitor, right? Or the desk clerk or whatever. You're not even a nurse or, the highly paid, highly trained healthcare professionals, just for the lowest level employees at any Kaiser facility. And in context, and again, since this is largely in California, fast food workers just got a raise of up to $20 an hour minimum for them, right? So why should you be a healthcare worker and have to take people's lives in your hands
and get sick
when you can make almost as much money flipping burgers and have none of the responsibility and stress? Not to mention, for instance, John, you and I both live mainly in Los Angeles, and there are many Kaiser facilities here. But many of the people who work in those facilities can't afford to live near them. So they have to commute from the Inland Empire or what have you, right? It takes an hour and a half each way, right? And
certainly.
As they say, what with today's high gas prices, that's very difficult to do. Never mind, you have to sit there in your car for an hour in traffic, and then you have to go to work as a nurse. I mean, this is not a low stress lifestyle. And if you don't feel that you're being well compensated for it, it's easy to see how there could be a large level of employee discontent in this sector.
Other key demands from the workers of Kaiser Permanente, in addition to the $25 per hour minimum wage, is a reformed bonus structure. Kaiser has offered across the board wage increases of 12.5% to 16% over 4 years. The unions say that is inadequate. Kaiser is one of the largest U.S. medical employers, 68,000 nurses, 213,000 technicians, clerical workers, and administrative staff, 24,000 doctors. It serves about 13 million people in 8 states and the District of Columbia. And I know this is a strike against Kaiser, and so this data point I'm about to give is not Kaiser, but healthcare is 20%, give or take, of our national GDP at any given time. This is a money-making bonanza. And
yes,
in fact,
Kaiser is technically a non-profit, right? But in the most recent year, I believe, they brought in $3 billion or so in what they call net income, because it's not profit, apparently, right?
So that
Now,
was 3.4 billion in net income.
some three some odd billion in net income, right? And so it seems that there's room to
Yeah.
to
They've got
negotiate
some
here.
margin.
Yeah, and the negotiations are ongoing, right? Well, we don't expect that this will go on forever. We hope it won't. But again, and I know we spoke about this last week. Uh, it wasn't that long ago when healthcare workers were national heroes, right? And so, okay, are they? And is that the compensation they get is just being called heroes? That's just not going to cut it. Uh, and I thought it was interesting, actually last week also when uh, the president of the United Auto Workers, Sean Fain, was standing shoulder to shoulder with President Biden in Detroit. Uh, he had a rather expansive message to deliver in which he said, whether you're and I'm paraphrasing here, obviously, whether you're an auto worker or an actor or a nurse or a teacher, sort of positioning himself as the leader, not just of the United Auto Workers, but of a broader labor movement. And we've seen this happening all year. There have been strikes in many sectors of the economy, warehouse workers, right? We talked about how the UPS strike was narrowly averted, right? There was a rail strike averted almost a year ago. Labor is standing up for what they can get. And I think it helps a lot that there's a worker shortage, right? They know that they've got the leverage.
So I was reading, I believe it was CNN's coverage of the Kaiser strike, CNN.com. And the headline is, this is the largest workout ever in the healthcare sector. And that is newsworthy, right? 75,000 people. At the bottom of this story, it said labor trackers, for lack of a better term, I'm making that up, predict that 2023 will be the year with the most strikes since 2019. And I thought, so maybe the pandemic interrupted what was a larger groundswell, a larger awakening of labor consciousness in this country.
I think that's very astute. Yes, I think that almost certainly is correct because there was a UAW strike against GM that year, or at least a threatened strike that ended up being resolved. But I think these pressures have been building for a very long time. President Fain, he speaks out relentlessly against corporate greed and the billionaire class, much in the vein of Bernie Sanders, as we discussed last week. And Bernie Sanders, he didn't ever get the nomination, but his was a message that resonated with many people across this country because just the inequality of wealth that's been building up for generations in this country has gotten to be too much for people to tolerate.
Any other thoughts on Kaiser?
There could be, I haven't heard of any additional strikes being planned, but there could be. There hasn't been a lot of development in the auto workers strike this week. The negotiations are still ongoing. I gather that there has been some movement from General Motors, which was the last of the big three to report such movement, or that the UAW said that they had made some progress with all of them, right? First it was Ford, last week it was Stellantis, and now it's General Motors. So they're all slowly sort of getting in line. I saw on television this morning that President Fain sent out a tweet, or whatever it's now called, with just a photo that was photoshopped from The Bachelorette, right? Where you had three well-dressed gentlemen, but superimposed over their faces were the logos of the big three, right? So, and just as we spoke last week, right, he's actually coming right out and not saying it, but using this image to say, yeah, that's right. They're all competing for me, right? I'm the Bachelorette, right?
The workers are the Bachelorette.
Yeah, that's right. And they're all the bachelors who are trying to woo me, right? And I thought, I think that's pretty funny, right? But more than that, I think it's just interesting that he's not afraid to basically come right out and say this. Right?
And to do it in a format that plenty of people who don't follow labor trends or broader economic news will understand.
That's right. And much as he likes to sort of posture himself as a very sort of old school union guy, right? For instance, again, when in his speech with President Biden, he was standing in Willow Run, right? The Willow Run plant in Michigan, which was the home he mentioned of Local 174, which was the home chapter of the legendary, iconic UAW president of the post-war era, Walter Reuther, who incidentally was very quietly one of the main financial backers of Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, right? If King ever needed a bunch of money really quick, he knew he could go to Walter Reuther. Very few people knew this at the time, but Reuther was very much an important backer of Dr. King. And this resonates throughout President Fain's message of economic and social justice. And so he mentioned Walter Reuther. He also mentioned, and I've seen him repeat this in subsequent addresses, that the Willow Run plant was, during the Second World War, the arsenal of democracy.
Of course it was.
Mainly the B-24 bomber. They were making a B-24 once an hour at their peak. And he said, President Fain, that is, said that it's once again the arsenal of democracy. And we are the workers in that arsenal. And the enemy is no longer foreign nations. The enemy is corporate greed and the billionaire class. And which I thought was pretty remarkable, frankly, that to equate contemporary billionaires with the Nazis. I mean, that's, pretty far out there, I think. But he said it like it was nothing. And so, again, as he's trying to sort of position himself as the leader of the broad national labor movement, in that same speech, he talked about teachers and actors and nurses, right? And so he's trying to position himself in the tradition of Walter Reuther, who is an old school guy, but he's still very much a 21st century figure, right? He's adopted these novel tactics in his strike of moving gradually, going against all the big three at once, and now using Twitter, right? And
specifically bachelorette memes.
Yeah. So he's bringing the past and the present together in what I think is a very interesting and shrewd way.
I would have to say, on Working for Crusoe, our favorite recurring characters are, now I'm power ranking these, United Auto Workers President Sean Fain, and then a distant second is noted deadhead Fed Chair Jerome Powell. I would say those are our two favorite recurring characters at this point in the podcast.
Agree. Yes. Yeah. That Powell, he just keeps on trucking.
No, but, you love Fain, and I am appreciating that, because I don't think there's been a leader in the labor movement that has brought this kind of vision or language or electricity, for lack of a better term. And again, we're not trying to say this is not a pro-labor podcast explicitly, but we've both worked for a living, so I think it's a sea change in organized labor in this country.
I do find him a fascinating figure. I try not to let that color my judgment of him too much, but sure. I'm sure that does seep in, and there's not too much I can do about that.
And listen, for anybody who thinks we're just two guys railing against people who own businesses, Sam and I both have hired people. We're musicians. We've had to book gigs and rent rehearsal space and pay drummers, right? You and I both very acutely, in kind of a primordial sense. I always joke that being an independent musician is a primordial capitalism, right? You get this kind of caveman business education. We understand the pressure of what labor cost is versus the profitability of the endeavor. Like that's a reality. At no point would I want to suggest that the automakers or Kaiser don't have a right to have net income, don't have a right to profits.
Not only that, but we've said over and over again that wage inflation is inflation, right? It's not that we don't want people to get paid more, because we do want that to happen, but we understand that will only add to inflationary pressures in the economy, and that's something we don't want. So there's a conflict, right? And there's conflict in everyone's life and everyone's understanding of things. And to pretend that you don't have that conflict, I think, is the larger intellectual problem. That's just my opinion.
To Slovakia, a land of 5.4 million people. It is approximately the size physically of the Dominican Republic or Switzerland. And if you don't quite have a grasp of that geography, it's much wider east to west than it is, tall north to south. So if you took Slovakia and put the western part of it on San Francisco Bay, the eastern part of it would be in Reno or Lake Tahoe.
Yes.
You could do the same thing, Chicago to Detroit or Los Angeles to the Arizona, Nevada, California border.
Yes, there. It's a tiny country.
Yeah. And they had their first snap election since 2012. And the winner was former Prime Minister Robert Fico's party.
That's right.
Direction, Slovak Social Democracy, also known as SMER or SMER.
That's correct.
They won 23% of the vote, 42 seats. 42 seats in the 150-seat National Council is not a majority. You need 76. Progressive Slovakia, a liberal pro-Ukrainian party, won 18%. It is of note that SMER, Fico's party, won the largest plurality because he is being reported almost unanimously, almost total consensus as pro-Russian. He is a left-wing populist.
Yes, that's right. In fact, I need to apologize because I mistakenly referred to him as right-wing last week. And I guess, but the thing is, he is a nationalist, populist, pro-Putin figure. So I think I could be forgiven for thinking of him as right-wing. I think he's only called left-wing because I think he supports, larger welfare spending, essentially.
I want to dive into this because they're going to have an interesting coalition, right?
Yes.
So the left-wing populist Direction, Slovak Social Democracy, SMER, they win 42 seats. Voice Social Democracy, led by another former prime minister named Peter Pellegrini, that party is also called HLAS. They won 27 seats. Pellegrini used to be a member of Fico's party back in the day, right? So these are the two big blocks. They won 27 seats. 27 plus 42 is 69 seats. A very nice number, but it's not the 76 for a majority, right? So
but they're almost there.
All right. So who do they have? The ultra-nationalist SNS party won 10 seats.
Yeah.
So you have two kind of nationalist left-wing populist parties and an ultra-nationalist party that are anticipated to make up the coalition to run the government, and Fico might be the prime minister again, right?
That's
He's got the most votes in the coalition. But I wanted to talk about this because Slovakia is in the EU. Slovakia gave 4 million euro in an aid package last December to Ukraine. Slovakia's GDP is only like 30 million euro, right?
Yes. That's a lot of money for them.
It's a lot of money for the Slovakians. And that is thought by some to have been why this election pivoted so much on the Russia-Ukraine question.
Yes, and they actually share a land border.
They do.
With Ukraine.
Slovakia is right under Poland.
That's right. That's they're one of the three, I think, European Union nations that shares a land border with Ukraine.
Can you tell I'm excited about Slovakia? I just learned a bunch of stuff about it to talk about.
Well, yeah, honestly, there's not generally a lot of reason to to know a lot about Slovakia because they're so small. And I know I mentioned this last week, leading up to the election, there was a very good segment on the PBS NewsHour about Slovakia and their then upcoming election. And one thing that they mentioned is a sort of long-standing element of Slovak culture in which Slovaks always feel that they're being pushed around by larger powers, right? First, it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire for a very, very long time, right? Then it
was the League of Nations saying you've got to become Czechoslovakia.
That's right. So at that point, that means they're getting pushed around by the League of Nations and the Czechs, right? Then for a mercifully
Germans.
Yeah, for a mercifully short period of time, it was the Nazis, right? Then suddenly it's the Soviet Union. Then it's the Czechs again, right? And now it's Brussels.
It's the EU, yeah.
Yeah, it's always somebody, right? But see, if you're a tiny country, that's just what's going to happen to you.
The only way you get away from that as a tiny country is be an island.
Yeah, or that's why you're in the EU. I mean, apparently, the EU keeps its boot on the neck of Slovakia by giving them tons of money every year.
Right.
Again, there's not generally a lot of reason to keep track of what happens in Slovakia. The really sort of disturbing coincidence here, though, is that this snap election, again, this wasn't anticipated. This took place on the same day that the stopgap funding package passed the United States House of Representatives without aid for Ukraine included in it. And there's some question as to whether additional aid to Ukraine can be added to the United States budget going forward. Again, Slovakia is one of the smallest countries in the European Union. So at both the smallest and the largest level of the Western alliance, there's some question about ongoing aid to Ukraine. And that, I think, is why people are paying so much attention to what happened in Slovakia, is that it just seems to be part of a broader trend. By itself, nobody would care. But because it seems to fit in with a diminishing amount of support for Ukraine across the Western world, it's very disquieting to many people, and I think correctly so.
So Fico, the former prime minister whose party, Smer, won the most seats, and he'll probably be at the head of the coalition government, he ran saying we need to explore all options for peace immediately. And that's a pro-Putin talking point because, of course, suing for peace right now means Putin wins the war. He invaded and he gets to keep where he is.
Or yeah, or at least he gets to keep a chunk of what he's taken, right?
Now, I don't know if you saw this, but on DW, Milan Nish from the German Council on Foreign Relations, he told DW earlier this week that it's not a huge win for Putin. He said this Slovakian election was about domestic issues, right? He said Slovakia is decoupled from Russia on energy. So he was kind of the only voice I heard saying this is not as pro-Putin a victory as it is being reported, because it's the headline, right? Pro-Putin former prime minister wins Slovakian election, right? That's the pulse quickening headline that has rocketed around the world.
Yeah. And again, if it hadn't happened on the same day as the failure of Ukrainian aid to make it into the United States budget package, it might have passed almost without notice, but it just feels, again, disquieting. I think that's probably true. By itself, what happened in Slovakia is not a big deal, but it's just something that we need to keep an eye on, which I'm sure we will be doing in future episodes.
So Slovakia is sufficiently small that I shouldn't be worried about left-wing populists plus ultra-nationalists forming a coalition government, because if you've studied the 20th century, you know those are two ingredients of a bad soup.
Well, we're going to have to see. For instance, in just about a week, I think, perhaps two, I'm not sure of the exact date, but Poland, right next door to Slovakia, will be having their elections. And I don't have any real readout on how that's going to turn out, but we're going to have to figure out what happens after that. There's been some animosity between Poland and Ukraine lately over Ukrainian grain having to be transported over land instead of out through the Black Sea. And this has caused a collapse in prices for Polish grain. The agriculture sector in Poland is enormous and very important.
Ukraine and Poland are like what? Like Kansas and Iowa, right?
Something like that, yes, right? And so a breakdown in relations between Ukraine and Poland would be bad, right? For Ukraine especially. So we're going to have to see how that election turns out. Again, I haven't seen any polls about it. There's been a lot of other things for us to pay attention to, but that's something we're going to be keeping an eye on in the very near future.
Finally, super yachts, Dateline Monte Carlo. This is a piece by William Booth from 6 days ago, September 30th in the Washington Post. He was reporting from the Monaco Yacht Show, where the world super yachts are bought and sold. The collective appraised value of the super yachts at the Monaco Yacht Show, $4.3 billion. The biggest problem with the super yacht market today is that there are not enough super yachts. The sanctions on Russia did nothing, Russian oligarchs are like 10% of the super yacht market, right?
But that's not the reason for the sanctions.
No, I understand that, but if you had this like great hope that sanctions on Russia because of the war would cause the oligarchs to lose money and like their sales are holding steady, and the ones that did cancel orders, the other orders got snapped up by other billionaires.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's plenty of billionaires outside of Russia.
There are more billionaires than you might think.
Yeah, there's a record number of them, in fact, right? But so what? Now, you say that the sales of yachts had gone up to what, some
$4.3 billion in the collective value of all the yachts being showed at the
and that's an increase?
It doesn't say.
Okay, so is that a better yacht market? Is it a worse yacht market? We don't even know, right? This isn't an economic story, right? It's barely a business story, right? If you're a manufacturer of yachts,
well, it was in Monaco, Sam. It's an international story.
Yeah, I mean, Monaco's barely one nation. How is that international?
I'll be honest with you. I've had the privilege of going to Cannes each of the last 2 summers, which is very near Monaco, and walking around the harbor there. You see some of these super yachts, and it's staggering. So anyway,
sure you do, but this doesn't matter. If you're a manufacturer of yachts, how many yachts are you selling a year? Right. 1, 2, maybe?
So you've refuted my assertion from earlier this week that this was any way an economic story, and I appreciate it because you've brought the fire just as you did on Runyon Canyon about it.
Good. I'm glad.
All right. So next week, Polish elections in Slovakia forming their coalition government, and I guess developments in the labor market here in the U.S., right?
Something pretty soon, yeah.
John Ramey Media at gmail.com, John Ramey Media at gmail.com. For Sam Park, I'm John Ramey. Have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody.